What I'm going to do today is there's two parts of this theme. The first is finding common values, and the second is plurality in the emerging world order. And I'm going to first ask the question is, how do we find common values and what are they? And I will make some suggestions, and then I'll suggest areas where there is legitimate plurality that should be respected by different societies around the world. So let me first quit the first part here, finding common values. Now, when you ask about that, the first thing that often comes to mind when you ask people, whether it's especially government people or people working for NGOs or academics who work in law, in international law, for example, you ask them, what do we mean by common values? Well, they will say that's quite easy. There's an answer to that. It's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed by the United Nations in 1948 by the General Assembly as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and nations. So we don't need to discuss anymore about this issue of what are common values. It's already there. It's enshrined and it was endorsed by the United Nations. Why do we have to talk further? Well, the reason why we have to talk further and not take, it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's UDHR for short. Why is that not a sufficient document for thinking about common values? Well, there's several reasons. The first reason is that it includes rights that are very controversial today. You remember this was 1948, shortly after the Allies, as they say, defeated other countries in World War II, and they were very much, the document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, very much expresses the dominant values of, let's just be frank, the Western powers that were victorious in World War II. If you look at the document today, it includes articles that would clearly not be endorsed by, for example, the Chinese government and many governments around the world. For example, one article makes it very clear, I have it here on the slide, it suggests that the only morally legitimate form of government is one that is selected by the people by means of free and fair elections or secret votes. Now, obviously, that's one way of selecting leaders, but it's not the only way, nor is it the only morally legitimate way. It's very controversial to claim that free and fair elections today is the only morally legitimate way of selecting leaders. And we can be quite sure that if there were a General Assembly today discussing this sort of document, that article would not be endorsed as a kind of common value today. Or another article, basically endorsing the right to property, that everyone has the right to own property alone. Well, again, in capitalist countries, fair enough, that is the right to property is almost held sacred often. But in countries that adhere to socialist economic ideals, including China, it would be very, very controversial. And we can be sure that if there were deliberations today about what are common values, that the right to property would be highly controversial and likely would not be endorsed today by the United Nations if there were such a kind of discussion today. So another problem with the UDHR, again, the UDHR, it's a very valuable document, and I think it does help sometimes to promote human rights where people are oppressed, but it's certainly not a sufficient document when we think about what are the common values today. Another problem with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that it doesn't prioritize between rights and provides no guidance in cases of conflict. I mean, it's quite a long list of rights. Some of them are not very controversial, like the idea that nobody should be held in slavery or servitude. I mean, very few, if any, governments today would endorse that, or intellectuals for that matter. I mean, there is still slavery sometimes, but it's done in a kind of secret way and not publicly endorsed. Or for example, there's also the right to life, only crazy terrorists would object to that. I mean, those are universal rights or interests, and very few would object to them. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also includes rights that are very controversial or at least characteristic of economically developed societies. For example, this part of Article 24, that everyone has the right to periodic holidays with pay. I mean, obviously that's a good idea, But in poor countries that have many other priorities, you can't expect that to be endorsed in a very strong way. So there's a need to distinguish between the fundamental rights, or let's just say fundamental needs or interests that are true of people around the world, regardless of culture, regardless of the level of economic development, like the right not to be enslaved, for example, or the right against torture, or the right to life, versus other rights that are quite controversial in particular and depend upon sometimes culture and sometimes level of economic development. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't distinguish between, let's call them basic important rights, and those that are less important, or let's say more particular. So that's another problem why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights cannot be seen as a document that represents common values today. I mean, for one thing, even if some of these are endorsed at the level of principle, some of them are difficult to implement. Okay, what's another problem? Another problem is that the UDHR implicitly affirms an overly individualistic way of life. And you have to remember, again, that the UDHR represents pretty much the dominant outlooks of Western powers after World War II. So you have, capitalist defense of private property, and you have values and rights that are very important for individuals that seek individual autonomy above all else. Now, that's a bit of an exaggeration. So let me take back a little bit what I just said, because there was one Chinese philosopher. Of course, this is before the establishment of the People's Republic of China. He was close to the KMT, but he was also a kind of adherent of Confucian values. And he is said to have influenced the very first article of the Universal Declaration, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity. And this is a very important point, endowed with reason and conscience. And the word conscience in Chinese is liangxin, which comes straight from Mencius, from Mengzi. And apparently, P.C. Chang, the philosopher, was influential in getting that endorsed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's an exaggeration to say that it's kind of totally West-centric and individualistic, because there is this kind of Confucian element. That said, admittedly, we have to say that if there had been much greater representation of non-Western cultures and religions and value systems, not just Confucianism, but for example, Ubuntu and indigenous traditions from around the world, including First Nations, where I am now in Canada, obviously the document would have looked very different than what it is now. There would have been much more emphasis on the importance of social harmony. I mean, social harmony as a value in capitalist Western countries is not regarded as so important and fundamental, but in other value systems, including Confucianism and Ubuntu, the sub-Saharan African ethical system, clearly social harmony is sometimes viewed as the mother of all values. Or the protection for the environment. I mean, obviously, if indigenous traditions if representatives of indigenous traditions and First Nations had been involved in deliberations, there would have been much more emphasis on protection for the environment as a fundamental human value, as a common value. Unfortunately, because again, the UDHR is predominantly a product of the victorious Western powers after World War II, so there is these kind of values are lacking. Let's call them, for lack of a better term, non-Western values, which often are quite dominant if you look at the world's population. So what do we do then? How do we move from here? How do we find common values that are lacking, arguably, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Well, there's lots of things we can do and lots of things that have been done. One is let's start a new dialogue with leaders and representatives of diverse ethical and religious traditions from around the world. So we have thinkers, for example, Professor Du Weiming, who used to be at Harvard, now he's at Peking University, Beida, in China. He's been part of many of these, we can call them civilizational dialogues. And these include, so that the idea is to have a more inclusive dialogue than was the case in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including participants of, again, West traditions that are not characteristic or dominant of Western capitalist countries. And this has led to some results. The problem, though, is that the more inclusive the dialogue, the greater the number of participants and the greater the diversity of participants, it turns out it's very hard to achieve consensus on anything other than platitudes. Like one example, I've been part of these dialogues. They were much more common about 15, 20 years ago, because there was still hope that we could achieve something meaningful. But now, frankly, there's a bit more pessimism, not just because of the geopolitics, which makes it much more difficult to have, rational and informed debate between, let's say, China and the US, but also just because it's hard to agree upon meaningful global values that can have bite and that could shape political reality. So many of the abstractions are, we should all strive to be good and avoid doing bad, but they're so abstract that they do not have the power to shape political realities, which often involve controversial issues and how do we distribute scarce resources and where do we prioritize. So this is a bit of a problem. So what do we do? These intercivilizational dialogues have not been very successful, I regret to report. What do we do then? Well, another proposal, and this is at the national level. You have a lot of these global assemblies, national assemblies of randomly selected citizens in countries, for example, that discuss issues informed by experts and then come up with ideas for how to move forward. And those are truly representative at the level of the nation. The problem is that if we do these assemblies at the global level, just imagine the difficulty, again, of achieving a kind of consensus, given that there would be so many diverse participants, and the participants are unlikely to overcome problems that have plagued strategy one. In other words, it's going to be very hard to achieve consensus on anything other than platitudes and abstractions that do not have the power to shape global realities. Maybe it's worth trying. That hasn't been tried yet, actually. But frankly, it's hard to be very optimistic, though I would still think it's a strategy worth trying. So what are some other possibilities? Well, here's another possibility. Well, you have political theorists with global outlooks, much more sensitive. When I first started learning political theory as an undergraduate at McGill University in Montreal, we had courses that are sometimes called Plato to NATO. For us, political theory meant we learn about the ancient Greeks from Plato, and then we move forward, all the way through Mill and ending up with Rawls or NATO as a kind of half joke. The point is that it was a completely West-centric curriculum, and political theorists in the West hardly viewed non-Western traditions such as Confucianism or Hinduism or Islam or Ubuntu and so on as morally valuable. So, but today it's a different story. More and more, you have informed political theorists who really try to seriously engage with non-Western traditions and think about which values are universal and which ones are not, which ones are particular to societies. And one very inspiring thinker to me is Michael Walzer. And he's American, extremely broad-minded and sensitive to cultural difference. And he makes a very important distinction between what he calls thick and thin human rights. And he argues that only these thin human rights, sometimes we use the language of negative rights, against murder, slavery, and torture, and genocide should be viewed as universal. No sane government, or frankly, sane intellectual, would object to those. Again, you have crazy terrorists who might do so. I was about to say crazy theorists, maybe also. But generally speaking, we can achieve consensus among these negative human rights against murder, slavery, and torture. Of course, these rights are violated in practice, but the point is that at the level of public discourse, they're endorsed. And it's a matter of exposing the gap between the reality and the ideal. But at the level of ideal, there's really no dispute among informed people from around the world on the value of these rights. But when it comes to other rights, again, Michael Walzer calls them thick rights that are not these basic human rights. Examples might include the right to private property or ways of selecting leaders. Then we should allow for variation from culture to culture. We should allow for more morally legitimate variation. I mean, sometimes there's not morally legitimate variation. You know, if let's say a government assumes power by military coup or by, let's say, genocide, then obviously that's not morally legitimate. But if a government protects basic human rights, like rights against murder, slavery, and torture, and so on, and they're chosen by means other than competitive elections, then we should respect that as a kind of morally legitimate variation. Now, I think that's a promising approach, but again, it's a little still too West-centric in the sense that there's this emphasis on negative human rights as truly universal. But again, if you look outside the West and you ask governments and most intellectuals and political reformers, what are the universal rights for you? What are the truly most important rights, or let's just say human interests or needs? And very often people say, well, it's rights not to be poor, or rights to protect people from starvation, or protect people, or provide decent healthcare and housing. These are much more fundamental and universal. So it's not just the negative rights against torture and slavery and murder, but also we can call them positive rights, such as the governments have a positive obligation to protect people from starvation and to provide decent health care and minimal housing. These are also universal rights. Again, we need much more dialogue to think about what are the common values. But we also have to ask, you know, even the language of rights itself sometimes can be seen as a bit West-centric. I mean, some traditions don't use a language of rights to express what's fundamental about human needs or interests. And we shouldn't necessarily be stuck on the language of human rights as the only legitimate language of talking about common values. We should allow for different vocabulary, even if in substance there might not be much difference. So for example, when we talk about the need for social harmony or protection of natural environment, rights language might not be necessarily the best language to make sense of those fundamental common values. So again, this is more of an intuition because it's still an ongoing debate. But if we think about different strategies for moving beyond the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and for thinking about which values are truly universal, what are the common values that are shared by all humans, regardless of culture, regardless of levels of economic development, quite likely we're going to settle upon a minimal list, we can say, of human rights, although it won't always be expressed in this language of human rights, including negative rights against murder, slavery, torture, and genocide, and positive rights, such as the obligation of governments to provide for basic material needs, protecting people from starvation, from decent and decent healthcare, and also to protect the natural environment. I mean, more and more, it's so obvious now. I mean, climate change wasn't an issue when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being formulated, but obviously now it's a common value that should resonate with people around the world, regardless of culture or level of economic development. So this is basically where I think we would move if we're thinking about what are the common values. And doesn't mean we need to reject the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but certainly we need to build on it and not regard it as a sufficient document for thinking about common values. I mean, it was a product of its time, and perhaps now it's time to move on to something else that is much, much more inclusive of non-Western value systems, so that we can arrive at a truly inclusive and universal view of what are the common values. Now, I want to move on to the second part of this talk, and I won't spend too much time on it, but there's two parts here in this, that I think two important themes in our conference today. And the first, again, is what are the common values? But the second part is, what is the plurality that we need to reject, that we need to respect? And again, I really do think that the problem here lies much more in the West than in the non-West. I mean, whether probably it's more a deeper problem in the United States, but in other Western countries, you have a similar view that our political system is the best and ultimately one that should set the model for the rest of the world. And what do we mean by that? We mean a political system, a democratic political system, where political leaders are selected by means of one person, one vote. Again, that view also informs the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a relatively new view. It's only in post-World War II that it became a kind of dominant view. In the 19th century, the British liberal John Stuart Mill, I mean, he said, oh, no, not everybody has the equal capacity to make morally informed political judgment. We should give extra votes to educated people. He could make that claim and not be viewed as crazy. But in the West today, if you argue for alternatives to one person, one vote, you're viewed as a defender of autocracy, which is bad. It's morally illegitimate. Now, again, let's place ourselves outside the West. And of course, I've been working in China for many years. So to me, I have to ask, what is the dominant political ideal that informs the Chinese political system? Well, we can call it political meritocracy. In Chinese, it's 贤能政治. And this is the view that public officials are supposed to be selected and promoted based on superior ability and virtue. Virtue means a willingness to serve the people. Ability means a kind of demonstrated ability to serve the people. And public officials are put on through a decades-long process to select and promote, to be selected and be promoted. Now, it's not a perfect system. It's highly imperfect, just as Western-style democracy is highly imperfect. In practice, often it's not one person, one vote, it's $1, one vote. In China, highly imperfect. You often have corrupt leaders who are selected and who are not filtered as they should be. And both systems have advantages and disadvantages. It's the advantages of one person, one vote is that perhaps the problem of political legitimacy is less serious. But the advantages of the political meritocracy is that leaders can plan for the long term and without worrying about being replaced and so on. But the point is that both political systems have already political ideals that inform the practice, and they need to be improved based on their own political ideals. So yes, we can use Western-style elections as a standard for improvement in the West, and we can use Chinese-style political democracy as a standard for improvement in China. Always recognizing there's a big gap between the ideal and the reality, and we should strive to minimize that gap. But the question is, what standards should we use? Contrary to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to the view that's so dominant and dogmatic in Western countries, we should allow for diversity, diverse ways of selecting and promoting public officials. It depends on a country's, size for one thing, on a country's dominant political culture, on levels of economic development. These are all important issues, and we should allow for plural ways of selecting leaders and not dogmatically assert that there's only one way of selecting leaders. Again, it's not a problem in China. I think that most Chinese intellectuals, at least in my experience, recognize that there should be plural ways of selecting leaders. I haven't heard anybody who says that Chinese-style political meritocracy should be, blindly exported outside of China to other countries, regardless of culture and so on. But in the West, it's still a problem where people still think that so-called, I'm not going to say so-called, Western-style elections is the only more legitimate way of selecting leaders. We should allow for legitimate variation here. Where's another area where plurality is so important to respect? And I make these points because it's, on the one hand, it's obvious. On the one hand, it's not obvious because it's typically not, the form plurality is not typically respected. Here's another one. On the way of organizing economic life. Again, if you read The Economist or the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, typically speaking, there's a view that there's only one morally legitimate way of organizing the economy, and that's a kind of capitalist form of life, capitalist form of economy, where the right to property is respected and is held to be fundamental. Well, okay, maybe in some countries, but other countries, including China, are strongly committed to socialist ideals, where the strong priority of government is to alleviate poverty. Now, again, it's both socialist idea, but it's not only socialist. The Confucians, ever since the early days, including Confucius, Kongzi himself, said that the first priority of government, should be fu, basically to make people, to provide for people's basic material needs, and only then do you educate them. Jiao, this view has a very long history in China, and it's not a coincidence that the socialist ideals became dominant in China because they could build on this earlier value system which prioritized the need to alleviate poverty above other values, including the need to respect private property. Now, again, China, it's in the constitution. It's also committed to communism as the ultimate end goal. What does that mean? Well, again, it sounds bad if you're kind of American, but the communist ideal is a very beautiful ideal. It's the idea that advanced machinery does all the necessary labor, so people are freed from the need to do dirty and unwanted labor, and all humans have the equal opportunity to develop their creative talents and not be bound by mind-dulling labor. Again, it's a beautiful idea, and if it requires restricting private property to get there, then countries that are committed to socialism will do that. I mean, it's not to say that that countries should, blindly take away people's property, but sometimes when it comes to strong obligations to alleviate poverty, for example, where land distribution might be necessary, or to ultimately move on to a state where advanced communism, where advanced machinery does all the necessary labor, well, then maybe there might be some legitimate restrictions on private property. Again, we should allow for more legitimate variation. I doubt that as it stands that communism can be global ideal, but it certainly can be an ideal that informs China's political system. And other countries are just going to have to recognize and live with that, and recognize that there's a plural ways of thinking about how to organize economic life. Well, let me give one last example. And this one comes from countries that are often committed to Islam as a political form. Now, again, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, strongly affirms the freedom of religion in the way that it's manifested in contemporary Western societies. Well, yes, I mean, sometimes I agree that it's very important for people to have their freedom of religion, but it doesn't mean that all political communities everywhere should have exactly the same distinction between, private religion and public religion. Some political communities can legitimately endorse a state religion and even place constraints on the roles of other religions in public life, and maybe even on the freedom to change religious belief. Now, I'm not saying that that's something that personally that I would endorse, but if countries that, for example, have a dominant Islamic value system have policies along those lines, or at least draw lines between what's public and what's private in the religious sphere in ways that are different from Western societies, well, it's a form of morally legitimate variation. Now, I'm glad to report that in Western countries, perhaps the leading liberal philosopher, John Rawls, in his last work, before he passed away, on the Law of Peoples, he recognized this point. He said that what he called is he calls it decent hierarchical peoples that respect basic human rights. Remember, basic human rights against torture, murder, slavery, genocide, and so on. And we would also add some rights to provide basic material well-being. But if countries or peoples organize themselves so that they have political institutions organized around a dominant religion, whether it's Islam or another religion, and even that provides that only members of that religion are allowed to hold high political office, well, those, what he calls decent hierarchical peoples, should be tolerated by liberal societies when they interact in the international arena. Now, my view is that it should be much more than toleration. It should be some sort of mutual respect, because sometimes the word toleration in English, it sounds like, you hold your nose and say, okay, I don't like what you guys are doing, but I'll tolerate it, just like you might want to tolerate, forms of, well, anyway. But the point is that in the international sphere, and I'm going to summarize here before I conclude, we should allow for morally legitimate variation when it comes to three important things: ways of selecting public officials and political leaders, ways of organizing economic life, and ways of thinking about the role of religion in politics. In all of those three crucial areas, there will not be, I'm almost certain, common views and common values, and we should allow for morally legitimate variation. I do think that if we have a world where we can endorse some common values, like basic human rights, again, to use language of human rights, rights against torture, murder, slavery, and genocide, as well as positive rights, rights for basic material well-being, while respecting morally legitimate variation when it comes to ways of selecting political leaders, ways of organizing the economy, and ways of thinking about the role of religion in public life, we would have a much more agreeable international order, and one that allows us to solve problems. So let me end here, and I'm more than welcome critical views. Again, these are ongoing disputes, and probably 10 or 20 years from now, we would have yet different views, or maybe even within our discussion. So let me end here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you. I'll turn off my...
Right. Professor Bhatt, thank you. Excellent. I like to think I've listened to various speeches on this topic, but I dare say that was probably one of the most enlightening and refreshing, but also easy to understand. So I'm hoping that this segment, your speech, will be, once this conference is over, will be listened to by hundreds of thousands, even millions of people around the world. So thank you so much. And I was particularly interested that you brought forward the ideas of how these declarations were initiated in the first place, particularly that if indigenous populations had been included in the initial stages, social harmony and protection of environment would have taken on a very different role. And then you talked about the tyranny of vocabulary, and particularly what I call the tyranny of English, the interpretation of things, and then to weaponize language in ways that almost we can't have any more conversations. And I particularly also like your 3 points: the how do we select people, the ways in which we organize our societies and therefore economies, and the role of beliefs, religious beliefs and customs in our societies. Thank you very much. I like you, as I've said before, please stay on, and we'd like to invite you to participate in the first panel.
I'll be happy. Thank you so much.
And thank you for the recommending my little book too. Thank you so much.